Hello and welcome to The Voice Debate, a Sky News special event tackling one of the issues of our generation, the path to reconciliation. A referendum for an Indigenous voice to Parliament has been announced. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says this will be held during this term of Parliament. This is a decision for you, for all voters, on whether or not to change the Constitution. And the debate is already passionate. Tonight, we've brought together four of the most powerful voices in this discussion from different sides of the argument. In favour of a voice, From the Heart Director, Dean Parkin, and constitutional lawyer and Labor candidate, Dr. Shireen Morris. Opposing a voice are Coalition Senator for the Northern Territory, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, and Sky News host and News Corp columnist, Andrew Bolt. There is plenty to discuss, and just a reminder, as most of you know, I support a voice and have been involved in a committee to work up options. But tonight is about the arguments of our panelists, and we'll kick it off with a short 30-second outline from each of them about why we should either support or oppose an Indigenous voice. Jacinta, why don't you kick it off?
Well, it's my firm belief that you don't lift a group of people by treating them differently to the rest of those. And you certainly don't favour them over the rest of those. And in this case, we're talking about Indigenous Australians with regard to the rest of the Australian people. And as far as I'm concerned, we're all Australian people and we shouldn't be divided along the lines of race.
Shireen?
Thanks, Chris. I agree that we're all Australians and we're all in this together, but Indigenous people through the Uluru Statement are asking just for an advisory voice in their affairs when Parliament and government make laws and policies about them. And in the past, there were lots of unfair, discriminatory laws and policies denying them the vote, taking children away, defining who they can marry and where they can live. Now we have well-meaning policies like native title, closing the gap, Indigenous heritage protection. But let's face it, we're comprehensively failing to close the gap. And I believe if Indigenous people have a constitutionally guaranteed advisory voice so that communities can co-design solutions in partnership with government, we'll be better placed to get practical results and better outcomes. OK, Shireen. Andrew Bolt.
Well, I think it's fundamentally racist. I don't want any of us on this table to have different political rights on the basis of the race of some of their grandparents. It's also permanent. We are binding future generations who might look at this and think, gosh, that didn't work well, but this is in our constitution. It's also unnecessary. I don't think it does any good, practical good, and we already have consultation. We consult with Aboriginal groups all the time. Next to me is an Aboriginal politician. Over there is someone who, two people who've worked for Aboriginal outfits before. There's consultation galore. And lastly, I think it's dangerous. We don't know where this is going to go to. Logically, it leads to sovereignty, a form of apartheid. We don't know how it's going to be interpreted. We don't even know what the powers of this body are. We are buying something unknown, unnecessary, racist. We don't even know where it's going to go. I think it's just so wrong for Australia.
Dean.
Well, we're here for a debate, Chris, but I think there's a couple of things that we can all actually agree on. Firstly, that the quality of life for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples can and should be better than what we're experiencing right now. The second thing is that if we do want to see those real changes in the communities at the grassroots, we can't just keep doing the same thing that we've been doing year after year. And lastly, I think we can all agree that we get better outcomes when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a direct say over those issues that directly affect our families and our communities. And that's what this voice is all about. It's about giving a voice to the grassroots so that we get better outcomes on the ground, we get better results, and we get better taxpayer value for a lot of goodwill that's going into Indigenous affairs, and people just want to see better outcomes on the ground, and that's what this voice is all about.
Thank you. Some strong arguments there. We're going to have a hell of a time thrashing them out over the rest of this program. But let's start off by looking at this conversation starter, how we've reached this moment in history.
The referendum is on Saturday, and it's important that we should have the maximum vote.
The High Court delivered its historic judgment on the Mabo case.
The most important court decision.
The case is a moral victory
for the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants, and for their families left behind, we say sorry.
The Uluru Statement from the Heart is Australia's greatest act of faith, hope and love.
We are seeking to secure support for the question and the associated provisions in time for a successful referendum in this term of Parliament.
Reconciliation is a long time coming. A century or more of reforms, changes, disappointments, passion, moments in history. But we could be about to see the biggest change of all, a referendum to give Indigenous people a permanent voice. How radical are the proposed changes to the Constitution?
Interestingly, of all the various drafts that have been floating around for some years about this is the most minimalistic I've seen.
One thing that critics keep asking is, where is the detail? What would a voice look like? Well, under the previous coalition government, there was an extensive co-design process. I was part of it. And here's the result. 275 pages in black and white of what a local, regional and national Indigenous voice could be.
We presented a report to government. Government's accepted the report. Prime Minister Albanese has said that he'll see that as central to the development of the design of the new voice. We now have to take what we proposed back out there to the community.
It empowers a group of people who will be operating through that voice, which we've tried previously and it hasn't worked. I think we just need to move forward and deal with the real social, practical, economic issues of Aboriginal people.
So what do we know about the voice to Parliament so far? Well, Anthony Albanese has committed to a referendum in this Parliament, possibly as early as the middle of next year. The question will be simple. Do you support an alteration to the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? The voice will be established permanently. Only another referendum could abolish it. It'll make representations to Parliament, but it's not a third chamber. Its powers will be advisory only.
How do we give Indigenous people reason to believe that the future will be different from the past?
Whether you support the voice, oppose it, or like many, you're waiting to make up your mind, I reckon most of us reckon something has to change in this country. All children should start with an equal chance at life. So while some people say that this is about dividing the nation, I reckon it's a chance to bring us together. And whatever your view, we should all be joining the debate. There we go, Andrew Bolt. Firstly, there's no doubt that people want this to be unifying. You say it will divide the nation. Why?
Of course it does. Of course it does, because some people with Aboriginal ancestry, they get different political rights than everyone else. So how does that not divide people? You're going to be asking people for proof of their identity before they have a particular say. You're going to be denouncing some people as not representing Aboriginal people. And it's just, the whole thing strikes me as in itself divisive, and it's so unnecessary.
Shireen, you're the constitutional lawyer. How does giving Aboriginal people rights to a separate representative body not amount to an additional right?
Well, I prefer to be pragmatic and realistic rather than ideological about it. The current state of affairs is that Parliament and government do make Indigenous-specific laws and policies, like the Native Title Act, like Indigenous heritage protection laws, like closing the gap measures. And the constitutional reality is that Parliament has a specific constitutional power that it only has ever used in relation to Indigenous people. So prior to 1967, the race power was never used. After the 1967 referendum, it was only ever used with respect to Indigenous affairs. All this is saying is that Indigenous communities on the ground, as Dean says, should have a voice when Parliament makes laws and policies about them. I don't see that as divisive. I see that as bringing Australians closer together, because don't forget, Indigenous people were explicitly excluded from the Constitution to begin with. This is including them in the Constitution. It's about inclusion, not separatism.
Jacinta, this seems to be the strongest argument, that the Constitution gives the federal government powers to make special laws for Indigenous people. Therefore, shouldn't it listen to them?
Well, I think when it comes to dealing with Indigenous issues, we're starting from the wrong place, because we're assuming that just because one is Indigenous, that they're automatically at a disadvantage. I mean, I'm sitting here with myself, with Dean. We're not disadvantaged because we're Indigenous. And my argument has always been about serving the Australian people on the basis of need. Now, the most marginalised Indigenous Australians in this country are those whose first language is not English, who often don't have the education, the same level of education as someone like myself and Dean has, who therefore don't have the opportunity to articulate particularly those needs. Now, it's argued that this voice model is supposed to give them a voice, but they have existed. The bureaucracies have existed to serve them, but the bureaucracies have largely lived off the back of their misery. And so I don't trust that this mechanism is about serving them. And again, it suggests that all Indigenous people are somehow marginalised, and that doesn't actually solve our problems for us. And I don't see how there's a guarantee that this is about to do that.
Dean, you're charged with trying to convince people about the merits of an Indigenous voice. How can you convince people if many Australians, like Andrew and Jacinta, think that this will actually divide us?
When you actually listen to Australians from all walks of life, which I've had the great privilege of doing over the last 5 years, since the Uluru Statement from the Heart was presented through this campaign, there is a deep well of goodwill from Australians across the country towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and towards this issue in particular. People, they might not necessarily understand the statistics, they might not necessarily read all the closing the gap reports that are presented year after year, but they've got a sense that things aren't right for far too many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, as the Senator has said, in particular in remote communities, and that it's time to do something different. It's time for a change. And they're very much animated by this idea of wanting to see practical change on the ground. We've tried many other solutions in the past. We cannot just keep doing what we've done in the past. The status quo is a bit broken in that regards. And the voice is the most practical thing we can do. As the Senator says, giving a voice to those people that need it most, that have been ignored, overridden, sidelined and marginalised by the bureaucrats, by the politicians. It's time we listen to those mob because that's where the solutions lie.
Can I pick you up on that? Like, Shireen has worked for the Cape York initiative of Noel Pearson, right? Now, that shows us that we have been consulting. No one has been consulted more than Noel Pearson. Over an 8-year period, he got $150 million from the taxpayer for his initiative. There's also, in that area, $120 million fund that comes from Rio royalties, right? For 3,000 people. There's a huge amount of money, huge amount of consultation, and that didn't work. And it's not because there's a lack of an obligation in the Constitution to consult. They're consulting. In fact, we have, more than 30 big land councils. We have a Council of the Peaks representing 70 Aboriginal organisations, big ones, that consulted all the way through with Scott Morrison. You've got 11 people in Parliament identifying as Aboriginal. You've got 2,700 Aboriginal corporations. There is no shortage of consultation, and we've done it before with ATSIC, with the Aboriginal Advancement League.
What about consultation is not the issue. What about the point that something needs to change? We surely
something needs to change. But consultation's not it.
Can I pick you up on that, Anthony? You've got to give me a chance to pick you up on that. Let's be honest. Noel Pearson is one of the most famous people in Australia. Okay, he can pick up the phone to past Prime Ministers. Now, I am sorry, your ordinary person out in Arakoon or Wadeye cannot. So ad hoc consultation that privileged Indigenous leaders get to do now is not enough. That's the point.
But my point is,
it's not enough to empower the people who are truly not heard.
My point is, with all the consultation he did get and all the self-administration, all the autonomy he did get, the results in Arakoon, with all that money, and Cape York, the other 3 communities, have been atrocious. They've been appalling. They've been
we don't want to make it about
it's not
that
consultation.
Example. But
that is my point.
The other point about consultation, though, Jacinta, I'd like to get your point on this, is firstly, it's always been informal. There's been Indigenous advisory boards to Labor and Liberal governments, basically handpicked by Prime Ministers. The difference with the voice, to me, one of the key differences is Aboriginal people themselves will get to choose who will represent them.
So what? They can do it right now.
No, let's speak to this, because Aboriginal organisations will get to pick those voices. And this is where our failures lie, because we know that nepotism has existed for a long time. We know that there's a lot of Aboriginal people who don't have faith in Aboriginal organisations. We know that there's favouritism that has gone on. And to me, this is going to fall straight back into that trap of favouritism. And if you look at the consultation in terms of the Uluru Statement to the Heart, a big hunk that is ignored were the dissenting voices who didn't agree with that process, who weren't part of that process. It's not a legitimate representation of Indigenous people, but it has been sold to the Australian people that this is what all Indigenous people want, because Indigenous people are often co-opted, certainly by Labor, even by the unions and by organisations, to appear as though they get behind and they support these propositions. But we're not recognised as individuals in our own right, like all other Australians are, and we're lumped in a group based on our race, and this is another one of those exercises.
Dean, I want to get you to respond to that. No form of representation is perfect. We only have to look at federal parliament to see that. But how could you make sure that an Indigenous voice is truly representative?
I just got to pick one thing up the Senator said there, that no dissenting voices were heard throughout the Uluru Statement process. I was in every single one of those rooms that heard the views of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from around the country, urban, regional, remote, grassroots mob, talking about what was important to them. I can assure you that the debates were had, those differences of opinion were heard, and yet after all of that process, the most comprehensive process to engage our mob on this issue, the very clear proposal for a voice came out as the sole option for constitutional recognition. And I think, Chris, I want to actually go back to that. We've got to remember
how many people were consulted?
Just let me finish. We've got to remember that this whole process started with John Howard. Back in 2007, John Howard was the one that said, it is right that the nation should recognise
Is this where we're supposed to genuflect? John Howard.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait. Let me finish, please, Andrew. Let's have a respectful debate. I think the thing that we must do in this whole thing is allow for respect. We must include people, hear the different views. It was Howard that said we must recognise the unique status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples, and we should do that through the Constitution. Every single Prime Minister since has held that bipartisan commitment. Coalition, Labor, and it still exists to this day. There's a lot of
that is Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. That is not necessarily a voice, although I think it's a practical reality at the moment that there's a consensus of Indigenous Australians, as much as you can have that, saying there won't be recognition without a voice. It's how Indigenous Australia says they want to be recognised. Let's continue the discussion and just move it along a bit. I want to get you to, Shireen, to take this point up for us, and that is the fact that we don't have a bill from Labor about what a voice would look like. We don't have detail. So critics of a voice can say anything they like about it. Supporters don't have anything to defend. When will Linda Burney and Anthony Albanese actually show Australians in detail how a voice would work?
So I don't know the answer to that question, but it goes to the Senator's point about the question about whether it would be Aboriginal organisations, deciding the representation. I don't think that's at all clear. I think it's the co-design report put out a lot of detail, as you said earlier, Chris. There are options there. So in terms of how it will work is still an open question, and I would urge us all to actually input into that process to make sure that this works well.
That's a big problem, isn't it, Andrew? It's an open check.
Because what you're going to get, and you've seen it with some of the distribution of royalties, etc., and some of the land councils, right? Big man politics. If someone of one particular clan or family, they dominate, I don't want to name names, but you know probably exactly who I'm talking about, the others miss out. They don't get a fair share. And what is we going to make it perpetual that this big man politics exists in an institution under the Constitution, and this person represents Aborigines when they don't? I mean, Dean's already fallen into the thing of, Aborigines want. Well, I'm sitting next to someone who identifies as Aboriginal. They don't want what you're saying. I think this is the whole thing. We need to be very clear. Is this about democracy? We don't know. And in fact, we don't even know what powers this has. This body can have powers given to it by any future government, Greens, Labor, Liberal, whatever, in the future.
Yes, but
you don't know what powers it's going to have.
They could do that now under the existing race power.
None of us know what it could do.
So could I just make the point, though, on this big men politics? One of the excellent ideas that the co-design report put forward was the idea of gender equality. So I do think that there are some people thinking really hard about these issues and wanting to design this in a way that is different to the institutions of the past, and that really does empower grassroots communities, including women across the country.
I think the emphasis...
I'd like to speak to a woman who was already disrespected, disregarded and kicked off the voice process in the very beginning of these consultations from the very top level, which was Josephine Cashman, because of her concerns that she wanted to put on the table that the Australian Corruption Commission had investigated communities and organisations and Indigenous organisations right across the country and had found there to be corruption, crime and corruption was rife. And when she attempted to table this as part of not only this issue, but the issue of individuals who are falsely identifying as Indigenous, which is a huge issue that we're faced with, she was then kicked off that committee, and yes, she was kicked off by a former colleague of mine, Minister White, but also Marcia Langdon had a huge role in that. So it's not just, this is that exact politics at play, which will be embedded with the voice, and I can't support it.
We need to continue this substantial debate, and we will do throughout the rest of this program, but I want to show you a publicity stunt from last weekend when the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, had the former NBA basketballer Shaquille O'Neal come out to a press conference and endorse the voice. Dean, you're trying to sell this idea. Does this sort of celebrity superficiality do more harm than good?
When I saw this, Chris, I was actually out at Kalkarinji in the Northern Territory with the Gurindji people out there celebrating the Freedom Day Festival, and it felt a bit weird. Seeing that, I have to say I was a little bit shocked and certainly didn't expect Shaq of all people. I mean, I think at this point in time, what it appears that the government is trying to do is to try and raise awareness of this issue. There was a celebrity in the House at the time. I think the focus of this has to be on grassroots communities. I think we should absolutely be getting the voices from the people. And as I said, I was out there at Kalkarinji and that's what people were talking about. They were talking about the need for their voices to be heard. So I think I prefer to be listening to those.
They were talking about it.
We will take a break. We will pick up on that segue. We'll talk about some of those grassroots voices when we come back after this break, because the trauma afflicting some Indigenous communities is all too clear. Poor health, education failures, domestic violence and tragedies ripping communities apart. Can a voice to Parliament help? We'll have a special report after this break and more from the panel. Welcome back to The Voice Debate, a special Sky News presentation focusing on the looming referendum. More from our panellists, Dean Parkin, Shireen Morris, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price and Andrew Bolt in just a moment. But first, whether or not you support a voice, no one denies the shame of Indigenous disadvantage in this country. On average, compared to the rest of the country, Indigenous Australians die younger, are less likely to finish school or have a job, but they're more prone to problems with alcohol and they're 15 times more likely to end up in prison. Sky News reporter Matt Cunningham has travelled to one of the Northern Territory's communities and looked at these challenges.
Australia's beautiful red centre. But below its pretty facade, Alice Springs is a town in crisis, racked by social issues stemming from Indigenous disadvantage as more people from surrounding communities head to town, often in search of alcohol.
A group of people are in the middle making a mess. They're not worried about white fella rules and they're not worried about black fella rules.
During the day, men queue outside hotels waiting for the doors to open. At night, children, some as young as 7 or 8, wander the streets unsupervised.
There are still one too many families that are suffering because of, the rivers of grog and the impact of alcohol on those families.
A national debate has begun about enshrining an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice in the Constitution. But can it do anything to solve some of the social issues plaguing parts of the Northern Territory?
If we talk about the whole process of voice, truth treaty, truth is a big part of it, and I think that Aboriginal people need to sit down. We've all got different views, and we all need to tell some home truths to each other, but work together to try and get a better outcome for our mob.
This voice will be a handball so that politicians don't have to take responsibility for the decisions that they're making or not making on behalf of vulnerable Australians.
Alice Springs councillor Michael Little runs training programs for Indigenous men trying to adapt to a white man's world. Would they support a voice to Parliament?
Well, I'll probably shrug the shoulders and say that's good, because the education isn't there about the purpose of having a voice in Canberra. Half of the people wouldn't even vote, I'm pretty sure of it.
In late July, Anthony Albanese put the national focus on the voice with a speech at the Garma Festival in northeast Arnhem Land. Just 2 weeks earlier, there was an incident outside Alice Springs that attracted far less media attention. 30-year-old Alina Kulka and her infant son Orlando were shot dead by her violent partner in what police say was a murder-suicide.
I don't want this to happen to another Indigenous woman and her baby. If something can come out of this that protects women and children, then that's what the government needs to do, that's what the community needs to do. We need to protect the most vulnerable people in the community.
Alina's uncle, Mark Lockyer, grew up in an Alice Springs town camp. He says the voice debate is a world away from the issues facing many Aboriginal people.
I don't think it really matters to them. It's not important. I think the most important to people in communities here is having a safe place to live.
Matt Cunningham there in the Territory. Jacinta, you've lived these issues, you've suffered tragedies in your family, you've tried to draw attention to these issues, and you say politicians don't want to hear about it. Wouldn't a voice be a way to bring them to the attention of politicians?
You know who doesn't want to hear about it more than politicians? It's Indigenous people who have been part of the grievance industry, who they're the ones that don't want to hear about it, because as long as Aboriginal people are marginalised, their positions remain in place. If we actually approached our issues with some truth, I hear the word truth being talked a lot, and I would like to have seen Marion right here on this panel as well.
I should point out we invited the Indigenous Affairs Minister Linda Burney, the Assistant Minister Malandiri McCarthy, and of course Marion Scringemoor. They all accepted at various times and then didn't turn up.
And that's disappointing. And that's the point I want to make, is that Justice Kelly recently made points about this. The fact that we're too interested in looking like we're not a racist country, that we ignore the reality of what's going on the ground, the issues that I've been advocating for so long. And I really don't see how this model is actually going to address that. There's no way it's confronted these issues. And it is, again, as Mark pointed out, the most marginalised, uneducated, who don't have a clue what's going on. So therefore, it is the elite who are driving this particular agenda. And how those people are supposed to fit into all of this, I still don't see how that's the point. We need to get people in those positions to a point where they can actually participate in this debate before we even have this debate.
Dean, can you make a voice practical? Can it actually lead to practical outcomes that benefit Indigenous communities? And if so, if not, is it worth doing?
Well, you absolutely can. The first thing I'd do is put those two people that were on that film on The Voice. I'd put them there because they know exactly what's going on in their community. I'd trust them to come up with the solutions for the challenges that they're talking about with their young people, with the challenges around the men and what's happening in those communities. I certainly wouldn't be leaving it to the bureaucrats and the politicians in Canberra and Darwin. I'd be sticking them on The Voice. That's what this is all about.
You don't have the power.
The reality. That's what The Voice...
You don't have that power. What do you mean? You'd be putting them on this?
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be an election.
I'd be saying that those people on The Voice would be a massive benefit to those communities back out there, getting real solutions that actually work on the ground.
In those communities, you're hoping that those people would get selected by their peers to be on a local voice.
Absolutely. That's been a driving principle of this the whole way through. That's what the people talked about through the Uluru Statement and all of that process. Cutting through the existing structures that do not listen to the people like Michael and others who actually know what's working on the ground.
Specifically, the people who do not listen. I followed Jacinta's career for so long, and she was talking about this stuff. She got crapped on from such a great height by Aboriginal community leaders for so long, it was a disgrace. And you only need to look back at ATSIC, right, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Commission. That is the body, the kind of body that you're talking about, but you want to make it permanent, almost unsackable. You want it in the Constitution. While it was there, it was riven by allegations of corruption, big man politics. There were people going around. There were reports like Bonnie Robertson's report on sexual violence in Queensland, which would make a stone cry, what it described. What did they do? Nothing. Don't talk about white bureaucrats. You have a look at what Justice Kelly has just been saying in the papers.
I'll come to that in a second, Andrew. I just want to address that ATSIC issue. Shireen, we all know that ATSIC was a representative body and a funding body. We know it was corrupted and we know it was abolished. How can a voice not repeat those mistakes?
Well, I think we've got to learn from the strengths and weaknesses of ATSIC, and we've got to be honest in having these very honest and very detailed design discussions that we need to have. So I think one clear difference that the co-design report points out is that this will be an advisory consultative body. It won't be in charge of funding and administration. Secondly, I just want to go...
Sorry, that's not true, by the way. That's not true.
I just want to go to what the video brought up in terms of alcohol. I think this is a fantastic example of why something better is needed. Very recently in the Northern Territory, we've seen alcohol bans being removed against the wishes of many Indigenous communities. That is a perfect example of how grassroots voices are not being heard when so many people in communities were saying, please don't remove alcohol bans.
I'm a senator for the Northern Territory. I'm drafting a private senator's bill to re-establish those. That's what my position is as an elected member, representative of the Northern Territory. The people that I represent have called for these bans to be put back in place. So that's what I'm doing.
That's what you're doing.
Within
but what about Shireen's point that
within the Parliament,
under a voice mechanism, if a government like the Territory government or the federal government was going to do something like get rid of those alcohol bans, there would be an opportunity for a voice to actually advise them and might say, no, don't do it before they actually go ahead and do it.
But those voices are there. So what is wrong? No. What wrong is that the Labor government that, of course, you were previously a candidate for, Marion Scrimgeour is right there. She is within Parliament. It is within her power to actually do what those voices have asked of her to do. How is this constitutionally enshrined voice? Do we need to be constitutionally enshrined to actually get the people who are in power to put those changes into place, especially since this voice mechanism can be shrugged off by whoever's in power anyway?
No, I think you do, as Karina Ocatel pointed out. You know, legislative requirements to consult with the community in the NT were swept aside, right? They were swept aside. That is why you need a constitutional guarantee to change the culture. And harm could have been avoided, frankly. Harm could have been avoided.
So we are redundant. We are redundant as a democracy right now. So this Labor government is redundant. It cannot put its foot forward and man up. Albanese can't man up to make the decision to reinstate alcohol bans given that people are dying. You're telling me only a voice can make that happen.
I'm saying we can improve the system so that communities don't get ignored.
I don't get it.
It can step in.
The logic is not there because we're told this is a purely advisory body, right? So it's about getting advice. Well, this government is getting advice from lots of people, from Jacinta, from people in the Northern Territory, from what? Don't do it. And the Northern Territory government is getting advice. Don't do it. They're still doing it. So what's the difference? It's constituted, but it has no power. So how's the difference? There is no difference.
Well, we'll come back to that topic. Obviously, we'll carry weight.
I think the required consultation and the required receiving of advice is a real difference.
People pushing this out, getting this advice right now.
I think those voices were swept aside.
Let me move on. We just mentioned, Andrew just mentioned Justice Judith Kelly, a Northern Territory Supreme Court judge, who made a powerful speech just a week ago, some of which has been reported in the media. I want to show you something of what she said about the situation in the Territory. She said, everyone is willing to talk about the over-representation of Aboriginal men in prison. It's been called Australia's shame, and so it is. But as I've said before, the stream of Aboriginal men going to prison is matched by a steady stream, a river, of Aboriginal women going to the hospital and the morgue. It's an epidemic of extreme domestic violence, and I'm certainly not the only one to point it out. Let's get your perspective on this, Dean, because it comes back to this practical advantage of a voice. We've heard about people complaining about the wrong decisions being made. Why would its advice actually carry more weight and force politicians to tackle these issues?
Well, firstly, the idea of going to a referendum and taking the Australian people along with us on this journey is really important in this. The idea that the majority of Australians and the majority of people in the majority of states getting that double majority up, giving their support, giving the popular will of the Australian people to say, this voice is important. It is very important that we have the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from the communities advising the politicians. Quite frankly, if the politicians had all the answers, we wouldn't be seeing these problems right now. It would have been fixed. So clearly, that situation can absolutely be complemented. It is fantastic that we've got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the parliament right now. And we know that by bringing the voices of more grassroots people to decision-making about what happens in communities is absolutely going to see better results on the ground.
Andrew, just let me put this question to you, because your argument just now is really that a voice might not be effective, that governments might not listen to it, and governments will continue some of the mistakes they've made in the past. Fine. But what do you fear from the voice? What could it actually do that might make things worse?
My argument is slightly different. It's totally redundant, because there are voices now, and the people pushing this voice thing aren't listening to them, okay? So they're not obliged to listen to them anyway. If advice is what you want, it is out there. My whole point is the advice is out there. This voice offers nothing except a privileged, entrenched bureaucracy. And what could it lead to? Well, the fact is, if you think philosophically, people with some Aboriginal ancestry are so different from the rest of us that they need their own parliament, right? It's something that no other race of people in this country can have. Then you're obviously conceding that perhaps there's a different form of sovereignty also. And in fact, Dean's voice says we don't see sovereignty. Next on the agenda is a treaty. In fact, you've already got, like around Cairns, for instance, the Yidinji nation, people setting up what they call separate sovereign nations, which Linda Burney, I took her to one of them, the Aboriginal Indigenous Affairs Australians Minister, I took her to that and she said, this is a model that I support. So philosophically, when you think people, by virtue of their race, are so different from the rest of us, they need their own parliament, you're on the way to their own government. And don't tell me, oh, look, it's only advisory. You don't know what a High Court could do. You've got no idea. The High Court has found implied rights to all sorts of things, including, one last thing, including the right not to export foreign-born criminals from Australia. You can't deport them if they have an Aboriginal ancestry. Who thought they could think of that?
Shireen, let's talk about those constitutional risks, but also the idea of race as opposed to being Indigenous.
Well, firstly, Andrew's completely contradicting himself. On one hand, he's saying, let's not do this because it won't change anything. It's only advisory and no one's going to listen to the advice. On the other hand, he's saying this is going to be sovereignty, separate nations, the world's going to end,
Shireen,
all of that.
you deliberately misunderstand me. What you're telling us is that it's only advisory. I don't believe you.
Well, let me assure you that this was actually a concept that was devised in collaboration between leaders, Indigenous leaders and constitutional conservatives, precisely because they didn't want the High Court mucking around with uncertain symbolic language. They wanted something simple, modest, a machinery amendment that would merely enable Indigenous communities to give advice to the policymakers in Canberra, non-binding, certainly not a parliament, Andrew, that is a complete and utter mischaracterisation,
legislate it.
given that there's no power to make laws, no power to veto laws whatsoever.
No, sorry. It says, you say, you don't even know how it's been constituted. You don't know.
But we know the constitutional. We know the constitutional recommendation.
We know what's required by
the Clause 3 of what the Prime Minister has proposed says, and it will have powers and functions which aren't defined. Do you know what powers are?
It actually says the Parliament
Yeah,
the Parliament will define the powers.
The Parliament will define
any future
we'll
Parliament.
Come back to some of these issues. We better get to a break. The Parliament will be supreme, and that is actually the case now. But we can get back into this after the break, because we want to go into more of these issues as we continue the voice debate here on Sky News. Because after the break, I'll put to the panel some of your questions that you've sent into us that get to the heart of these matters. Don't go away. Welcome back to The Voice Debate, a Sky News special program. Now it's time to hand the debate over to you. You'll ultimately decide on a voice in the referendum, and some of you have sent in your questions for the panel. Let's get into it. Brad from Sandstone Point in Queensland says, will the voice have more power and influence than the 11 currently elected Indigenous Australians in the Parliament? Jacinta, this sort of flows on from the discussion we were having about how much power the voice will have.
Well, from what I have read in some of the breakdown of the proposal, is that, so say for I want to put forward a bill, a private senator's bill, I have to at some stage claim, say that I have had consulted with the voice with regard to this, even though I'm an Indigenous person from the Northern Territory who consults people widely, hence why I'm putting forward my no position, because Indigenous Australians around the country, not just the Territory, have expressed their deep concerns to me. But it will be suggested that I would have to consult the voice first before I put this bill to Parliament. So yes, it certainly undermines my voice as an Indigenous representative. And I'm proud of the fact that we have 11 Indigenous representatives within Parliament, but now it's suggesting that our voices, I feel, we will become redundant if this measure is put in place. What's the purpose of us being there? What's the purpose of us trying to, we've reached parity in Parliament, which is what we've always pushed for as Indigenous Australians, more than parity. And now we've got to have this overarching voice.
I'll put an example to you. I'm a fan of Jacinta Price, you might have noticed. And if she could be our first Prime Minister with Aboriginal heritage, that's what I sincerely I'm hoping
to switch
for.
to the lower house sometimes, Jacinta.
No, she will. You wait. I'm on the Jacinta Price fan club. Jacinta Price Prime Minister, right? She's then got to consult with another body that say, no, we represent Aboriginal Australia.
But why not?
It's preposterous.
But I don't think that's preposterous at all. Let me get Dean to take this up, because this is an argument we're hearing a lot, that there are 11 Indigenous people in Parliament, which is wonderful, but somehow they make a voice redundant.
Well, firstly, I don't think that that's quite correct, Senator, the proposal that you are compelled to seek the advice of the voice, and I think that certainly has not been part of the conversation up to this.
I read the document.
That's not what the proposed constitutional change that was announced by the Prime Minister at the recent Gama Festival says. It says very clearly that the role of the voice will be to make representations to the Parliament and government.
Langdon and Calma points that out.
And that it will be up to the Parliament itself to determine the functions and the structures and the makeup of the voice. So, Senator, you will be part of the lawmaking process to determine the structures and functions of how the voice will work. So, if you want a mandatory obligation, you can give it one, if that's what you want. But it will be up to the Parliament itself to decide what those functions are. So it's not quite correct. It's not correct.
That's not entirely correct.
It's not correct to say that you, at this point in time, will be compelled to seek the advice of the voice before you table a bill in the Parliament.
There's a suggestion in the document itself by Langdon and Calma. So that's what I'm going with.
Dean, you're not quite correct either. I mean, you say at this point in time, so obviously you're foreseeing that some future Parliament will make a
I'm speaking to the detail
it's a blank screen.
I'm speaking to the detail that is known at that point in time, Andrew.
Even on that detail...
So far, the constitutional...
I just need to finish.
We just need to move on, because really that's there.
But the point is, he's ignoring the High Court's rules, right? The High Court, we see that right now. The immigration minister has the power to make individual determinations of certain immigration matters, right? It's entirely in his power. But the High Court can come in and say, well, listen, by the way, you haven't made enough consultation. You haven't made enough consideration.
But it doesn't say that. The point is that the clause as proposed now just says make representations to the Parliament. It doesn't
Wait till the High
oblige
Court gets
Parliament. We will see. Let me just get your thoughts, Shireen, on this point about the 11 Indigenous members of Parliament and how that makes a difference to the voice. People say that is the voice.
Well, I think they're completely different functions, right? And I think that Indigenous MPs will benefit from hearing the advice of Indigenous communities across the country as much as non-Indigenous MPs. And remember, Australian parliamentarians, whether you're an Indian Australian, Chinese Australian, white Australian, Indigenous Australian parliamentarians, you can't just represent your ethnic background. You've got to represent all Australians in your electorate, and you've got to represent your political parties, right? So the Indigenous advisory voice is fulfilling a different function in that it's amplifying the voices of Indigenous communities around the country, which I think will be helpful to Indigenous MPs and every other MP as well as they make their policies for Indigenous affairs.
Okay, let's move on to another. Sorry, guys. Let's move on to another viewer's question. And Phil in Victoria's Dandenong North says, "Will this body be transparent and open to public scrutiny? And how will this body improve the lives of remote Indigenous people?" Jacinta?
I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to answer that because I don't know that the processes have been as transparent as we'd like them to be. I don't know how it's supposed to improve the lives of people in remote communities. It sounds like, Shireen doesn't have faith in the current government, the Labor government, to do their job because, as she said in her statement so far, that they've swept aside any consultation and advice, and this is supposed to hold their feet to the fire somehow and make them sit up and actually listen to and take responsibility for the voices that already exist. I mean, that's what I'm hearing, and then I'm hearing from Dean that this is about, that goodwill to make them feel better about being non-Indigenous, to feel like they're part of something to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. That can't explain how it's going to improve the lives of, and not just all Indigenous Australians. I want all Australians' lives improved, but marginalised Indigenous Australians, again, it doesn't make you instantly marginalised just to be Indigenous, and that is the biggest problem we've got, and that's what this body treats us all the same.
I think in answer to that question, we'd probably all agree that the body should be accountable and transparent and open to scrutiny. But the point is, we don't know yet because the government hasn't put out a detailed plan, a legislation for what the voice would look like. Which goes to this next question too. From Bert has sent this in from Surrey Hills in Victoria. Who will be able to stand as a candidate for the voice, and who will be able to vote for the candidates? Dean?
Well, it's an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. So the candidates will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and it will. Minister Burney has said that that the government's preferred model is that it is an elected model. So opposed to what the senator said earlier about certain groups picking candidates, that's not what the government has said.
That's what Langdon and Calma have said.
That might be the case.
That's what Langdon and Calma have said in their report.
Langdon and Calma, with all due respect, are not the minister, nor are they the government.
Well, I think the minister knows what she wants.
Minister Burney has
I don't think Minister Burney knows what she wants. She wants an ATSIC model, and now she wants an elected model.
Minister Burney has talked about this being elected, but again, that is a decision for the government to make. As
the reality is, the report recommends different options, and there might be elections in some areas, or other communities might have a consensus approach. So just where the government goes,
but Aboriginal and Torres Strait, put there by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that's the key thing. And with all due respect to the politicians, as I said, the Indigenous politicians that are there, which, as I say, we support and is a wonderful thing. As Shireen said before, they have accountabilities to their electorates. They have accountabilities to their political parties. And then on top of all of that, they're expected to have accountabilities to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as well, who didn't put them there in the first place. So that's what this voice is about. It is about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people above politics, having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives to represent us on those key issues.
We are right up against time. I want to give everyone a chance for a short wrap-up. Let's start with you, Andrew. Can you give us just
it's just so sad.
Points?
I mean, Dean, you're a lovely bloke, but to hear you speak in terms of us and them and race and this and you can only speak for your own people, it's so sad. We're Australians together. There is something more fundamental about us than our race. You know, we share other things, much more. And you want to put in the Constitution that you can't white it out at all, that we're to be permanently divided by our race.
Final word from Andrew Bolt and Jacinta.
Look, why don't we then have, I find it condescending that we're having this discussion about our race, because we wouldn't have it about white Australians. We don't have a voice for white Australians. We don't have a voice for Indian Australians. We don't have a voice for Chinese Australians, African Australians, because we don't expect all those groups to all think the same, or that we need people from our race only to represent us. It's
Shireen?
Divisive.
There's no Native Title Act for Indians. There's no Native Title Act for my family. That is the practical reality we're dealing with. And I think about so many laws, like, for example, the Wild Rivers laws up in Cape York, that have prevented Indigenous economic development on their land. Even today, trying to get individual home ownership on Native Title land is difficult. All this is saying is we want Indigenous communities to be empowered to take responsibility in their affairs so they can work with Parliament and government to improve some of those problems, help close the gap.
It's a very good thing that this issue won't be decided by panels like this. It's going to be decided by the people in urban areas, in the suburbs, in regional areas in remote Australia. And the really encouraging thing is that when we have the conversations with them, people get it, they get the simplicity of it. They feel like that this is something that the nation should do, and they want to be included in this. And I'm really keen to, as we progress this campaign and move closer to a referendum, bringing more Australians along with us, and I'm very confident that we'll achieve our goal.
Let's hope that panels like this, though, help people illuminate the ideas and make up their minds. Thanks so much for joining us, Dean Parkin, Shireen Morris, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, and, of course, Andrew Bolt. Thanks for joining me. Thank you, too, for joining this conversation. Let's continue the debate with passion and respect. Respectful disagreement, that's what democracy's all about. Thanks for watching.